Good evening, everyone, and thank you all for joining us tonight. My name is Elena Strong. I'm the Executive Director of the National Museum Bermuda, and I would like to welcome you to tonight's virtual lecture, From Hamilton to Charleston, A History of Bermuda Stone in Charleston, South Carolina, by Justin Schwebler. This lecture is part of our Bermuda and the Atlantic World Lecture Series, one of many ways the National Museum is providing opportunities to better understand Bermuda's past and ties to the Atlantic world. Whether cultural, familial, social, or political, Bermuda has links with the North and South America, the Caribbean, Africa, UK, and Europe. This lecture series explores these links and the global forces that help shape Bermuda as we know it today and how Bermuda shaped the Atlantic world. Tonight, our guest speaker, Justin Schwebler, will be diving into Bermuda's connections with Charleston, South Carolina, in particular, our Bermuda limestone. He will explore the importation, use, and surviving examples of Bermuda stone throughout the city. Justin is the property manager for Historic Charleston Foundation, which is an advocacy organization advancing the mission of historic preservation. The foundation champions the historic authenticity, cultural character, and livability of the Charleston region through its advocacy, stewardship, and community engagement. And it envisions a livable Charleston that honors its historic places, its people, and its culture. In his role as property manager, Justin is tasked with the management and preservation of 6 historic buildings, 2 of which include historic house museums, the 1808 Nathaniel Russell House and the 1820 Aiken Rhett House. He is also a member of the Foundation's Preservation Advocacy Team, leading historic preservation initiatives throughout the South Carolina Low Country. Justin graduated in 2015 with his Master's of Science in Historic Preservation from Clemson University. His thesis was titled The Forgotten Stone, A History and Analysis of Bermuda Stone in Charleston. Before welcoming and handing over to Justin, I would like to thank the museum's generous community of donors. This lecture series is made possible by the museum's Future of History campaign, which supports education, expansion, and institutional stability. Please note that this session is being recorded and will be available on our website and YouTube channel, where you can also find the other lectures from this series. After the lecture, we'll have time for questions. If you have questions that come to mind during the lecture, please put in the chat. The NMB team will be monitoring the chat throughout the lecture, and Justin can answer the questions at the end. Now, I'm going to hand over to Justin Schwebler. Thank you for joining us from Charleston.
Thank you, Elena. Thanks for the introduction, and I hope you feel better.
Thanks. I hope I'm going to go off mute and off video because I'm probably going to cough through your talk. All right.
That's great. Well, thank you again. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm here in sunny but cool Charleston, South Carolina. I hope you all are being spared from this kind of cold front that we're going through right now. But yeah, I'm here to speak this evening a little bit about some research that I conducted, as Elena had said, as part of my master's degree. What seems like a long time ago now, back in 2015. The years have flown. But yeah, this evening I was doing a brief lecture talking about, well, from Hamilton to Charleston, just kind of the connections that were made between our 2 communities in the Atlantic world, primarily in the 18th century. So who am I? Why should you listen to me, to a guy who's never actually been to Bermuda or set foot on the islands of Bermuda? Again, my research as part of my master's degree was looking into Bermuda stone, and that may seem kind of strange to y'all. It makes up your islands, the islands of Bermuda, the limestone itself. It's almost like me, I don't know, somebody studying the dirt of South Carolina or something. And I'm sure somebody has, but it's a foreign material here in the city of Charleston. It has a really unique history. And really, the question came about very early on in my graduate studies. As part of our orientation here in the city of Charleston, we were walking around, and there's a historic house that was pointed out as part of our preservation kind of degree orientation, that the house was constructed out of Bermuda limestone. And that seemed like a curious question to me. It's a very small island, way out in the Atlantic, 800 something miles away. And just, it was kind of amazing to me that somebody would bother to transport a material, enough of a material to construct an entire house in a different city. And so that kind of formed the basis of my thesis question all these years ago. And kind of led me on a wild goose chase, kind of investigating this material where it shows up in the city of Charleston and kind of leads us to our point of discussion today. So that was really the basis of my thesis research. After graduating, I went on to work for Clemson University at the Warren Lash Conservation Center doing large object conservation, so staying in the field of kind of preservation and conservation. And then I've since moved on to Historic Charleston Foundation, which Elena touched on briefly, where I am largely in charge of the preservation and maintenance of our 2 historic house museums and a number of other properties that we work on, as well as being involved in different preservation advocacy projects throughout the South Carolina Lowcountry. So I'm very lucky to have my position and to be still in the kind of architectural conservation preservation field, and get to do that in really one of America's really preservation kind of gemstones of the city of Charleston. So that's a little bit about me. But we'll dive quickly here into the kind of history of Charleston and Bermuda stone that we're here to talk about this evening. So for those of you, I really hope you get an opportunity, if you haven't ever, to come visit the city of Charleston. So just kind of a macro view here real quick. Where is the city of Charleston? You can see on that Google Maps image or the Google Earth image on the right. We're about 800 miles, a little over 800 miles directly west from y'all. So the sun will set here a little bit later than it will for you, but you know, Charleston is a beautiful city. Today, we're very lucky to have an incredible inventory of historic architecture that's been preserved really intentionally. Charleston was really the center of the historic preservation movement in the United States. That started in the 1920s with the foundation of the Preservation Society of Charleston and continues to this day. We have really active historic preservation ordinances that protect the historic architecture of our city and provides oversight for any new construction, demolition, or modifications to the exterior of buildings. The organization that I work for, Historic Preservation or Historic Charleston Foundation, we manage almost 500 preservation and conservation easements on historic properties throughout the city and also through the Lowcountry in Charleston County as well. So really, preservation and architectural conservation are really core to the culture of our city and is really a testament to our legacy and what makes our city special in the American South. That we have these kind of this longstanding legacy and tradition of preserving what we have, which gives us access to an immense amount of cultural heritage that we can study and understand and research to, you know, reestablish those ties that may have otherwise been forgotten. And a huge part of that is our connection, the city of Charleston's connection to the island of Bermuda. And so we'll start to get into that here with the establishment of the city of Charleston, or Charlestown as it was known originally. So the city itself was founded in 1670. There were 3 ships that came from England. They originally went to Barbados and then actually landed in Bermuda to kind of get the last band of settlers and final kind of groups of supplies before they made their way to the South Carolina coast, really as the primary establishment of the province of Carolina. So in 1670, the settlers made up of Englishmen, Barbadians, and Bermudians settled on the Ashley River. So here on the left side, you can see this is called the Crisp map. It comes from 1711. So this is a few decades after the settlement of Charlestown. They settled a little bit farther up on the Ashley River there, which is on the southern end of the city. So the orientation on these maps is always a little bit different in the 18th century. But they set up a kind of a rough ramshackle settlement on what was called Albemarle Point. And that's named after one of the ships that they came on, and Lord Albemarle, who was one of the Lords Proprietors in England, who was overseeing this province of Carolina. And so they settle on a section on the Ashley River. It's kind of a swampy, marshy area. It's not great land, but they're trying to set up an immediate fortification because there's always a risk in the kind of British colonial eyes of attacks coming up from the Spanish in Florida at St. Augustine. It's really only a stone's throw away when we're looking at you know, kind of the naval sailing vessels of that age. Castillo de San Marcos, which is the kind of major fortification that the Spanish established, is already constructed at this point in St. Augustine. And so the Spanish are really looking to try and extend and maintain a foothold in the kind of North American South. So the British are very cognizant of that, and they start to defend and fortify their settlement very quickly. But the climate, the land itself that's on the Ashley River isn't ideal, and so they very quickly decide to move to what's now called the peninsula, the peninsula of Charleston, where the city is, the major kind of downtown city proper is to this day. So they move over to the downtown to the peninsula in 1680. So about a decade later, they make the official jump over to the peninsula where it's at now. And that city is actually the first laid out and officially planned city in North America. It's laid out by John Locke, the John Locke, and what's called the Grand Model. The Grand Model really outlines the establishment of sort of a utopia, an idealistic utopia for the province of Carolina. And part of that is the model and the layout and the city plan of the city of Charleston. And it's intended to be a fully walled and fortified city, really to defend against the French and the Spanish and the kind of colonial wars that are happening at that time. And also from pressure from the Native American tribes who are living and occupying their ancestral homelands in and around the Charleston area. Those fortifications are established in 1704, so only a few short years before this map is produced that outlines the layouts of the city that we see at that time. But again, Bermudians are on the first ships that are arriving here in Charleston. The Somers Isles Company that makes up, the kind of pre-colonial government of the islands of Bermuda are really responsible for the transfer of a lot of these settlers. Their economic interests are really focused on an agrarian economy and not as much of a maritime economy until the Somers Isles Company gets disbanded later in the 18th century. But that really drives the kind of impetus of trade and establishing long-term settlements in the Carolinas. And the majority of those supplies and people and settlers are coming from Bermuda and also Barbados. But Bermuda is really typically the touch point between England and the Carolinas. So that kind of quickly moves on. The city just instantly starts to explode. It was really growing immediately at a rapid rate. And that's really due to Charleston and Bermuda and Barbados's participation in the African slave trade. And so Bermudians and Charlestonians and English are going to West Africa, collecting enslaved Africans, bringing them to the West Indies, and then bringing them to Charleston. And in particular, in Charleston, the rice trade, or the rice, the planting and cultivation of rice crops is what really establishes Charleston as an area of wealth and an agricultural economy in the American South. And that legacy continues all the way up until the American Civil War in the middle of the 19th century. But Charleston's economy and population immediately begin to boom once they kind of make the final transition to the Charleston Peninsula in the 1680s. So by the kind of first few decades of the 18th century, we're looking at a map here from the 1730s. You can see the boundaries of the walled city, the fortified walled city, are still intact. But the city itself, the suburbs are already starting to expand outside of that original city plan. So the peninsula is beginning to fill up. That kind of landscape is already being transformed. There's infill that's going on in the creeks. You can see the shaded areas on either side of the walled city are tidal creeks that sort of bound in the original city. Those get filled in very quickly. Bridges are built across those. People actually start pulling down sections of the fortified wall because they're not as afraid of Spanish incursions and military intervention. So they start pulling down the fortifications and expanding the city. And a huge portion of this population are Bermudians, and they're setting up kind of small communities in and around the city of Charleston, on James Island, Johns Island, and even back at the original settlement site known as Charlestown Landing, or the old Charlestown Peninsula, or the old Charlestown Plantation. And so by the 1720s, 1730s, the city is really operating as kind of a touch point in the Atlantic trade networks that are established at that time, and Bermudians are playing a huge part in the growth and economic progress of the city. This is a look at the waterfront of Charleston, roughly at that time. So this is an engraving from a 1740s newspaper in London that's a reproduction from a painting that's roughly contemporary with the map that we just looked at, but really shows you how the city evolves on the peninsula of Charleston, immediately adjacent to those brick fortifications right along Charleston Harbor. I don't know if y'all know this, but the kind of colloquial story in the city of Charleston is that the Ashley and the Cooper River come together at the city of Charleston to form the Atlantic Ocean. And this is kind of the point where that's happening. And so this, in the eyes of Charlestonians, this is the center of the world. Everything is coming to this city. People, enslaved individuals from West Africa, the majority of enslaved Africans, we think almost half of all of the enslaved individuals who are imported to North America are brought in and transferred through the port of Charleston. So this, again, just talks to the volume of people, the volume of economic stimulus that's coming here from the Atlantic trade networks that are established is all getting funneled into the city of Charleston. As part of that, the Bermudian traders themselves are here operating. Yes, they're participating in the Atlantic slave trade, but they're also participating in the kind of mercantile trade economy of the Atlantic world. So on the islands of Bermuda, that primarily consists of Bermuda stone, which we'll talk about here shortly, Bermuda cedar. They're also going down to the Turks Islands, the Turks and Caicos to Barbados, and they're collecting salt and bringing that salt, which is really the kind of most expensive and important commodity, especially early on in Charleston's colonial history. They're bringing the salt to Charleston, offloading it and selling it for incredible profits all across the kind of east coast of the United States, but especially here in the city of Charleston. And then the kind of mercantile goods and commodities and rice crops and agricultural products that are being produced here in Charleston with that enslaved agricultural economy are then going back out of the city. And the kind of the workhorse of that economy is the Bermuda sloop. And so, as you all well know, and are probably much more knowledgeable in kind of naval architecture than I am, the Bermuda sloop is really a revolutionary contribution to the Atlantic trade world. Dr. Mike Jarvis has done a fantastic amount of research into the islands of Bermuda and their kind of economic importance. His book, In the Eye of All Trade, really outlines the kind of importance of the Bermuda sloop in the Atlantic world. Bermudians are constructing these, fast, revolutionary, shallow draft vessels with these kind of wildly raked masts that revolutionize the way mercantile trade is handled around the world, really, and that is most easily recognizable in the trade networks that are established in the West Indies and on the Atlantic coast of the what would become the United States. And in the 1730s engraving, you can actually see some of these ships outlined at the bottom, which are typical examples of a Bermuda sloop. But you can see them here in Charleston Harbor in the 1730s and the 1740s. So obviously the artist is already making a connection with the people who are participating in the economic trade that's happening here in Charleston, and that is clearly a very common presence at our waterfront here in the early decades of the 18th century. And so a major part of that cargo and that economic trade that's happening in the city of Charleston is Bermuda stone. The limestone of the islands of Bermuda is a really important trade item, and it starts to show up in Charleston very early on in the city's settlement and establishment. And it continues to grow throughout the 18th century, not only as Bermudian influence continues to grow in the city, but it really starts to become a known commodity in the city itself. And that sort of culminates here by the end of the 18th century. So this map actually comes from the 1790s. It's known as the Iconography of Charleston from the 1790s. So this is kind of after the American Revolution. You can see that the walled city, the original fortified city, has since kind of disappeared. It's been enveloped within the bounds of kind of the modern in the 18th century sense, but the kind of enlarged footprint of the city as it continues to grow. The walls are pulled down. You can see that the fortified seawall is actually demolished, and the wharves have already started to extend and infill land and capture some of the harbor as the city continues to kind of grow and expand outside its original bounds. We'll touch a little bit more on this map later on when we're looking into some of our investigations into some of the archaeology in Charleston where Bermuda stone shows up. But by the 19th century, you can see, the city is completely blown up out of its original bounds. It's really started to expand almost to its kind of modern day boundaries. This is in 1872. It's the bird's eye map of Charleston. And you can see even the landscape, the peninsula itself from those early maps has kind of disappeared. It's been completely enveloped, and the boundaries of the city have grown as land has been infilled Areas of marsh and tidal creeks have been filled with kind of debris and residue to capture and create more land for development. And so by this point, the kind of influence and the relationship between Charleston and Bermuda has largely been lost. The economic ties to Charleston and Bermuda are really first tested in a significant way during the American Revolution. And so in September of 1774, Continental Congress during the American Revolution decides to ban trade with Britain and Ireland and the West Indies. That obviously has significant economic implications, especially for Bermudian merchants and the families. The Tucker family is a really prominent family that's operating here in the American colonies at that time, and they actually are kind of lobbying Congress to make exceptions for the island of Bermuda because of how reliant Bermuda is on food goods and mercantile goods from the Americas. And so an outright ban with trade with the Americans could really have significant impacts on the citizens in the islands of Bermuda. And so Congress has a little bit of leeway in that they build in a clause where if it helps aid the American cause, you can trade with some of these networks. And so this all kind of comes to a head with a gunpowder scandal where about 100 barrels of gunpowder are smuggled out of a powder magazine on the islands of Bermuda that eventually makes its way to the American Continental Army. And the British government really starts to crack down. Parliament issues what's called the Prohibitory Acts and essentially blockades the islands of Bermuda, causes horrible famine on the island, and really cuts off trade between the Americans and the Bermudians themselves. The Bermudian mercantile fleet does operate fairly heavily in privateering during the American Revolution as well. Because of the economic pressure that's on the island and the loss of access to trade goods and foodstuffs, they're really almost forced into it as a way to just make money and support themselves and sustain themselves. And so that the privateering that's happening during the American Revolution really starts to put strain on the cultural relationships between not just Charleston, but Americans in general and folks on the islands of Bermuda. After the American Revolution, things kind of get back to a level of normalcy. Those relationships are kind of maintained and established in a detracted way, but they're still there. But really, the final nail in the coffin is really the War of 1812. And so, the Royal Navy learns their lessons that they learned the hard way in the American Revolution, and they make moves to kind of change the way that their naval operations happen in preparation to the War of 1812. We all kind of knew that this was coming, that there would be another conflict to decide the fate of the American colonies. And so by the time that the War of 1812 kicks off, we call it the War of 1812, but the Royal Navy has actually moved the North American station for the kind of naval squadrons that the Royal Navy is operating. They move the North American station from Nova Scotia, where it's operated for decades. They actually move it to Bermuda because of that importance and that connection between America and Bermuda. They know that this is going to be a hotbed for potential privateering activities or illegal smuggling activities that are going to be happening during that war. And so they want to centralize their control over the Atlantic and really be able to put a more immediate pressure on America during that war. They actually launch their attacks on the city of Washington, D.C. from Bermuda during the War of 1812. And so that is really kind of the final straw. It's the kind of final act that severs the economic and more deeply tied social relationships between the city of Charleston and Bermuda itself. And that has a direct reflection on the material itself. So Bermuda stone, which is the kind of core of this thesis, we really stopped seeing any importation of Bermuda stone, the material itself, following the War of 1812. We see it in some structures and in some buildings that post-date that time period, but we largely think that that material is probably being recycled from other sites. So it's, either buildings or walls are being pulled down and that material gets recycled and incorporated into new architecture after the War of 1812. It's not really imported anymore as a commodity. So here's just a quick kind of aerial view of the modern city of Charleston, the city today, and that kind of red box, that hastily drawn red box, is just kind of a rough outline of what the original walled city boundaries would have been. And so you can see down here on the left at White Point Garden, how the city has kind of expanded much more to the south, and you can see how these wharves, where it says the Pineapple Fountain there, you can see what's now ground was really open water. It was part of the Cooper River in the 18th century. And so those wharves that extend out get infilled and buildings are constructed on them, warehouses are constructed on them. And so the city's really grown and expanded and densified in a significant way outside of what was originally the 18th century city that Bermuda had such an important role at establishing and creating in the 18th century. And so really, let's start to really look at the material itself, at Bermuda stone itself. And as you guys know, you're experts, you stand on it every day. The islands of Bermuda are made up of many different generations and layers of coral stone, of limestone that gets created on this kind of volcanic mount that makes up the island of Bermuda. And throughout the 17th and 18th century, well into the 20th century, as you all know, the stone is quarried all across the island. And the two primary deposits, the kind of aeolian or oolitic stone, it's the much lighter kind of granular stone, is easily cut with hand saws and quarried and left out in the sun to kind of cure for a time before being incorporated into architecture. And then you have the very dense kind of true coral limestone, the marine deposit stone, the fossiliferous material, that's much, much harder to kind of quarry materialize. But we actually get both materials here in Charleston. So not just the lighter, easier to cut stuff is making its way here in the 18th century. We actually get both examples of limestone here in the city. And so it's important to understand both of those materials and how they're used. The block down there on the left, it's always great. I met my wife in graduate school. I don't know what interest she took in me. It was great, but it's always fun to justify. She asks what you're doing for one evening, and you say, "Oh, I'm going to go take lab samples and photographs of blocks of limestone as part of my thesis research." So, somehow it worked. So we're very happy that that worked out. But I'm also sitting here this evening with a little chunk of limestone. I just moved into a new house, and I'm actually unpacking some of my library and found one of my old samples. So I'm sitting here this evening with a small piece of oolitic Bermuda limestone. So y'all are here with me this evening. But we'll continue on. As the stone's being quarried and loaded onto ships to make its way really throughout the Atlantic, it shows up in Charleston very early on in city records. And so we see here already, these are two advertisements that come from the 1730s. On the top, you can see to be sold on board the sloop Industry, lying opposite of the market wharf, 2,800 Bermuda sawed stones. So 2,800 sawed stones. That's an incredible volume of material that's being marketed and sold in the local newspaper, which really tells us that the Bermuda stone itself is not really, possibly early on it's being used as a ballast material for the ships that are leaving Bermuda and making their way to the Atlantic seaboard of the United States. But really by this time in the 1730s, 1740s, it's clearly become a commodity in its own right. It's a material that's being imported with intention and with purpose, and quarried as a commodity and sent here to be used as building material. It's not just showing up here to be used as ballast like the river rock that we see throughout the city that's used in cobbling and that's used to infill tidal creeks and stuff. It's getting dredged out of rivers in England and Wales, loaded onto ships, and they dump it just kind of anywhere when they get to the city of Charleston. They're asked to dump it by the commissioners of fortifications, by the commissioners of the wharves to create landfill. Bermuda stone is not that. This is clearly something of value that people are wanting to trade and wanting to sell when it gets here to the city of Charleston. It's being imported with intention. And again, here on the bottom, an advertisement for the sale of some houses in the 1730s. Several houses and lots on Queen Street, now in the possession of Mr. Joseph Badger. And adjoining the corner of Church and Queen, also 3 others in Church Street built of Bermuda stone, all in good repair and built not above 5 years ago. And these houses are so well known as to need no further description. So I love that too. And so we see a number of advertisements like this. The house is so well known, they're in no further need of description. Bermuda stone is really seen in the early city as, something of high quality, almost a status symbol, really, to have a house constructed of stone. In the city of Charleston, where we are hundreds of miles away from any natural stone source, you really have to go several hundred miles overland into the upstate of South Carolina, which at this time period is really dangerous, kind of wild country for the kind of colonial settlers that are living in the city of Charleston. Or you would actually have to sail down to Spanish Florida and St. Augustine and use coquina limestone, which is somewhat similar to Bermudian limestone. It is a marine deposit stone, but has a very different kind of composition, geological composition. But that's really kind of the closest sort of marine limestone comparison that we have. So really, Charleston is primarily a timber frame city to start off in the 18th century. By the middle of the 18th century, they're starting to establish large brick-making plantations on the Ashley and the Cooper River that are primarily um, operating through enslaved labor. But those processes it take a long time to get established and to figure out how to make longstanding, durable, mixes of sand and clay and the firing temperatures to drive out the moisture in those soils. It takes a while for them to kind of master brick making in Charleston. And so in the early city, having a house made of stone, a house that really can resist the hurricanes and the fires and the earthquakes that plagued the city from day one, the settlement from day one, and happened with frightening regularity, as you guys well know, hurricanes throughout the Atlantic world. Having a house that's made of Bermuda stone in this time is really seen as something that's almost invaluable and is clearly so well known to need no further description. Everybody in the city knows these houses, and so the fact that they're coming up for sale is something to be desired, and I'm sure it did not take them long to sell. It really speaks to the quality of the material and the intention that the material is being brought here to the city of Charleston as a valuable commodity very early on. It's one of the earliest structures in the city that gets constructed of Bermuda stone that still survives and that we know of is what's called the Pink House. You can see on the right-hand side, it's known as the Pink House. It's been has this kind of pink lime wash paint on it. That's a famous property in the city. You can see on the left-hand side, there's a photograph, I believe from 1889. So kind of end of the 19th century, and the house is still roughly in its same condition, for better or for worse. Unfortunately, the house underwent a major renovation in the early 20th century, in the 1920s, and the house was largely re-stuccoed with Portland cement. And Portland is a tenacious material, and unfortunately has clung to the house as it does. So we haven't been able to see any of that stucco fail to really understand what percentage of this house is constructed of Bermuda stone, but it's very well known in the city that it is of kind of Bermuda limestone construction. On the image on the left, you can see at the top the kind of Dutch gambrel gable that's up there. What looks like kind of the ghost lines of brick masonry underneath the stucco. So it's likely that the gable ends themselves are brick masonry, but possibly the first and second floor of this house is constructed either partially or almost entirely of Bermuda stone itself. Now, moving on a little bit later, these are known as the Prelo tenement houses. They're also known as what's called the Pirates Courtyard. So these are actually a section of houses that are part of that advertisement for sale that we just looked at, the houses that need no further description. So there's this kind of two adjoining townhouses here, the yellow house there to the left, and then another one just around the corner from this house as well. They're possibly known to be as early as 1710. We don't really have fantastic dating evidence for these properties, but we know based on the kind of newspaper advertisements that they're at least there by the 1730s or early 1740s when these buildings are constructed, and are kind of part of that post-medieval kind of early colonial architectural style, kind of very early Georgian architecture that's appearing here in the city of Charleston, and again are in a context where almost everything around them would have been timber framed and has since been destroyed through all of the different kind of catastrophes and calamities in the city, like fires and earthquakes and tornadoes and hurricanes that we have that kind of decimate these early districts in the kind of the core of the original walled city. But what really makes this building special in particular is that, yes, you can see the stucco render here on the house, but if you look at the gap between the yellow house on the left and the white townhouses here on the right, we get a glimpse through the alleyway at the construction of this house. And you can see this beautiful example of this sawed Bermuda stone on display here in the alleyway. And because it's so narrow in that space, I think that they just never wanted to take the time to bother to stucco this portion of the house. And we're very lucky to have that on display. And you can see that, 300 plus years later, um, the Bermuda stone is still in fantastic condition and has weathered Charleston's kind of harsh coastal environment very well. And the house is still well maintained and it's still in good standing order. And so, houses built of good quality that need no further description. I think that advertisement rings just as true today as it did in 1730. So really a testament to the material itself and its longstanding durability. Here's another set of houses on what's called a St. Michael's Alley. And so this is really at the heart of the original walled city. This row of houses has kind of a mixed developmental history. They get constructed in the 18th century and heavily modified throughout the 19th century. But we have some great photographic evidence from just after the American Civil War. So in the 1870s, that gives us a clue onto their original construction. So you can see this house on the right-hand side. You can see those large Bermuda stone blocks that make up the lower wall section of this house here on the right. And so again, we have so many stuccoed masonry houses here in the city of Charleston. Many of them are largely attributed to just being of brick masonry because we have no better inclination for what the material is underneath. And so the kind of inventory of sites that I was able to kind of compile through my thesis research, I think is still kind of a low estimate for the true amount of Bermuda stone that we have here in the city of Charleston, mostly because all of it's hidden either under stucco or it exists archaeologically in foundations or in walls or in pathways and courtyards that have since been covered up just with kind of the evolution of time throughout the city. But we get these really interesting kind of glimpses into the past and into the materials themselves, and we can see Bermuda stone showing up really all throughout the city of Charleston. This is really one of my favorite structures in the city. This is 56 Trad Street. It's in Trad Street is really kind of the last truly remaining post-medieval, early colonial street in the original walled city. So by good chances and good grace, this portion of the city has never really suffered any of the major catastrophic fires that sweep across the city in the 18th and 19th centuries. It gets battered by hurricanes, but it's on relatively high ground, so not a lot of significant flooding in this part of the city. And it wasn't overly damaged by the horrible earthquake of 1886 that did so much damage in the city of Charleston. And a lot of these buildings luckily escaped those kind of major catastrophes. But this building is really special in that it is primarily constructed of Bermuda stone. Again, it's a stuccoed masonry building, so you wouldn't otherwise know that it's constructed of Bermuda stone except for some renovations that happened in the 20th century that were able to identify the material. Unfortunately, we don't have any photographs of that today, but we know the house and it's been well documented since then. But this house is really special in that it highlights the kind of durability of the importation or the length of time that Bermuda stone is being imported into the city of Charleston. And so this house is constructed in the 1770s. So the ones that we had seen early, it's possibly end of the 17th century. The pink house is kind of known to have been constructed in 1690. That's probably unlikely. We think it was constructed in kind of 1710, 1720, based on some dendrochronology that's been done at the house, but still very early in the 18th century. But this really just shows the kind of the length of time that Bermudians are bringing this material to the city of Charleston, that it's still being imported in great numbers by the time of the American Revolution, and kind of transitions the architectural design trends that are happening in the city. So the pink house and the tenants' houses as part of the Pirates Courtyard, those are really kind of that post-medieval, early colonial period architecture. This house, 56 Trad, is a perfect example of what's known as the Charleston single house. So Charleston's kind of primary contribution to vernacular architecture in the American South is the Charleston single. So it's a small house that's oriented with the narrow end towards the street. It's known as a single house because it's only one room deep. And so the house, the narrow end is oriented towards the street, and you enter onto the piazzas, which is what we call our porches, these kind of side porches that are on the south or the west side of the house. They're accessed through this piazza screen door. You walk down the piazza and enter into the central stair hall of the house. And in that central stair hall, you have one room, one chamber on either side of it, which is where the Charleston single house gets its name. But this is really an amazing testament to the kind of durability and the length that the Bermuda stone is imported into the city of Charleston, because it's kind of survived those different architectural trends and the different developments that are happening in the city at that time. And it's even made its way into some of the earliest examples of Charleston's kind of unique vernacular architecture that gets established as we kind of move away from that kind of Dutch colonial and post-medieval architecture of the early 18th century, and really Charlestonians establishing their own vernacular styles of architecture. And Bermuda stone is still an important part of that legacy that continues well into the 19th and 20th century. Here are just some other examples of Bermuda stone sites found throughout the city, and are probably a more readily available, identifiable example of Bermuda stone, like we said, because a lot of where it exists architecturally is obscured by stucco or brick masonry, where we don't have good access to see the material itself. The two images on the left, the kind of big pile of Bermuda stone and brick that you see there, and then the kind of stones oriented in a 90-degree corner, those come from the Ori Lucas plantation site. So that's actually on what's called Charlestown Landing, which is the site of the first settlement of Charleston, that Charlestown settlement that's established in 1670. This house, though, dates after that. So after the settlement has moved down to the peninsula, the Ori and Lucas families set up a plantation here in the early 18th century, and the foundation of their house and the front staircase, so this pile of stones here is actually the front steps to the house, are laid up in brick and Bermuda stone. And you can see that the foundations here are still very well laid out and nicely lined and established in Bermuda stone blocks. And it's been heavily aged and worn over those many years, but is still standing strong, and you can visit that site today and see the material in situ. The two images on the right-hand side, you can see a wall here at the top right that's on Water Street in Charleston. So we talked about those tidal creeks that sort of bounded the original walled city. The southernmost of those is called Vandross Creek. And that creek was intentionally infilled as the city began to grow in the middle of the 18th century. So they're infilling that creek, and they're building these boundary walls and partition walls along the creek with all kinds of different fill material and rubble that they can to kind of fortify the edges of the creek and then infill that to create dry, occupiable land. And this wall is actually running off of Water Street inboard to kind of higher ground along some of those properties. And you can see the wall is sort of a hodgepodge of different materials. There's chunks of marble, there's bits of granite and kind of schist material, there's lots of brick, but we can also see a significant quantity of Bermuda limestone that's incorporated into the wall itself. And we know that a lot of Bermuda stone exists archaeologically in this area too, because we know it was used to fortify some of those creek boundaries. And it has showed up archaeologically in some excavations under houses and in cellars that were constructed along that creek to kind of help give them stronger foundations on that kind of subpar marshy ground. The image on the bottom is a really fantastic collection of, and a great example of, the marine deposit stone that exists here in Charleston. So this is that really dense, hard Bermuda stone that's not quite as easy to quarry and mine as the softer oolitic stuff that's cut with the saws. But this marine deposit stone comes out of a 1750s mercantile trading house on State Street in Charleston. In the 1970s, there's a preservation contractor who's kind of acted as my mentor, and he went into this house in the 1970s when there was a new buyer and they were looking to do some work on the house, and the entire inside of the house, the ground floor level, was paved with this marine deposit limestone that had been laid down in the 18th century, and then the entire courtyard outside the house was paved in Bermuda limestone as well, and it had remained in situ basically since the 18th century. And that the maritime merchant and trader who built that house, his office, which was apparently a gorgeous kind of mahogany and cypress Georgian paneled office with this Bermuda stone floor, was left almost perfectly intact well into the 20th century, and unfortunately has since been heavily modified. And the family who took on that work in the 1970s unfortunately wanted to remove all this Bermuda stone, but thankfully the preservation contractor who was working on it recognized the significance and the uniqueness of this material and ended up saving it and taking it back to his house. And it has since been reincorporated into a paved courtyard at another historic house here in the city. So we're very lucky to have this quantity of stone, not in its original context, but being used in the kind of way it was originally intended to be used and is still accessible to this day, and not just ends up in a landfill, unfortunately, which happens all too frequently with our historic architectural material. But you can see just kind of the vast quantities of stone that are being imported to the city that show up not just downtown, but kind of all throughout the city of Charleston. We kind of bounce back now to that map that I had touched on a little bit earlier, the iconography of Charleston from the 1790s. And this is really highlighting what I think is sort of the zenith of Bermuda stone's importation to the city of Charleston. So you can see there on the left-hand side, that kind of red circle that highlights that triangular feature there on the left-hand side. That's actually a fortified seawall that's constructed in 1768, 1769. It's the largest civil project that's undertaken in Charleston's colonial history, so prior to the American Revolution. This map is from 1790, so postdates the end of the Revolution, but you can see those walls are still intact. And the commissioners of fortification create this civil works project to defend the southern parts of the city from the violence of the seas. And that wall, that fortified seawall, is supposed to have a 3-foot tall base of Bermuda stone and then capped with a 5 to 6 foot wall of brick masonry above. And so these images on the right-hand side, the top one is an archaeological excavation at what's called the Buttery of McLeod Plantation. So that's on James Island, so just one island down across the Ashley River from downtown Charleston, where there was a Bermudian settlement. But this was really what we were looking for, this kind of assembly of construction, this Bermuda stone with brick above. And the photo on the bottom is our archaeological trench looking for that fortified seawall. So kind of a confusing cross section there. You can see we have a large rubble fill wall, which could be a battered and fortified seawall, and then a kind of a brick garden wall there on the right-hand side. Well, that brick wall on the right, unfortunately, doesn't have a Bermuda stone base. So we know that's not the 18th century wall, and the bonding patterns don't match the 18th century. But the wall on the left-hand side, the rubble fill there, you can actually see broken large chunks of Bermuda stone. And that's where this sample that I have actually comes from that section of the wall. And so we found records that in 1800, the city is struck with a devastating hurricane that we think destroys and kind of churns up and breaks up that Bermuda stone and brick wall that's built in 1769. And that wall just gets reincorporated as the city's trying to repair and reestablish this fortified seawall. They just kind of take the old wall that's been broken by the hurricane, they chuck it into the rubble pile behind the wall to reestablish that protective boundary on the southern edge of the city. This really is the largest civil works project in the city of Charleston, and it actually has a direct impact on the amount of material that's being imported to the city. So one good thing about the colonial government that's operating here in the city is that we have fantastic records of material importation to Charleston Harbor for taxation purposes. And so we can see a direct volume of importation of Bermuda stone that's being taxed in the city of Charleston throughout the 18th century. And you can see that it slowly increases from the 1730s up until the 1760s. And there's really a drastic spike in importation in the 1760s, leading to over 25,000 sawed stones being imported and taxed in the city of Charleston. And that doesn't include stuff that's, not landing at the wharves and just kind of being dropped off. Or maybe kind of supplied to people without being recorded in tax records. But you can see in 1769, the volume of stone drops to 0. And we think that that is a direct correlation to this civil construction project, and that the amount of Bermuda stone that's required to build this seawall exhausts the entire supply of Bermuda stone that's being imported to the city of Charleston for those 2 years. And you can see good evidence of that in that the volume of Bermuda stone immediately spikes to even higher levels immediately following the construction of that wall, leading to its kind of zenith in the late 1770s or mid 1770s at over 40,000 blocks of Bermuda stone being imported to the city. So really a testament to the sheer quantity of material. I was joking with Elena this morning that it's amazing that the island of Bermuda is still there, just from the sheer volume of stone that's being, mined and quarried and taken abroad, not just to Charleston, but also across the Atlantic seaboard. Bermuda stone shows up in Norfolk, Virginia, and Smithfield, Virginia, and Williamsburg. The Tucker family's bringing it basically everywhere they go. Bermudian merchants are really quarrying and taking your island with you everywhere they go across the Atlantic seaboard. As kind of part of your ongoing legacy and contributions in trade throughout the Atlantic world. And so it's not just a Charleston phenomenon, but it's one that shows up here in incredible quantities and is really a significant contribution to our architectural and cultural heritage we're very lucky still exists to this day. And that's really all I have for y'all. And I hope you enjoyed and were able to learn something about Charleston's architectural history and the importation of Bermuda stone here. And I really hope that y'all are able to make your way here to the city and enjoy some of these sites and see some of your island home here abroad. So thank you all for your time.
No, Justin, thank you for your time. You covered a lot of ground in 45 minutes. And so I'm going to open up the webinar to questions. So you can either do it in the chat group or in the Q&A, and I'll just give a moment for everyone to kind of think and post some questions. But I can also kick off a question while people are thinking. But also, we did have someone in the Q&A, sorry, in the chat group, ask if you could go back to the slide showing the fortified walled, the walled city slide. If you can go back to that, please.
Let's see if I can get back here. This one here?
I think that, yeah,
the original
earlier on, there's the original walled city. While you do that,
slide 2 or 3, yeah, it'll take me a second.
Yeah, it's right at the beginning.
This one here? Okay.
I think so. I think that's the one they wanted to look at.
Yeah.
So we're waiting for some questions to come in. Oh, actually, I've got a question. What happened to the stone trade after 1780?
Yeah, unfortunately, like I said, the kind of benefit of the colonial government was that they had those really in-depth tax records. And so that's how we were able to really track the importation, that are tied directly to the importation rates and the taxation that's happening at that time. During the American Revolution, that record keeping halts almost entirely. And so by the end of the American Revolution, 1781, 1782, we don't get a good accounting of the material that's being imported to the city anymore. And unfortunately, most of our city's sort of municipal records end up getting lost during the American Civil War. So Charleston's facing the kind of impending approach of the Union Army to the city of Charleston in the 1860s, 1865. And Sherman, who's the general in charge of the Union Army, burns the city of Atlanta. And Charlestonians, in fear that Charleston is next and we're going to face this sort of inflagration and destroying of the city, they send all the records to Columbia, South Carolina. Sherman actually decides to turn away from Charleston, goes to Columbia, and burns the city of Columbia. And thus, we lose a significant amount of Charleston's kind of post-colonial, early revolutionary, or early United States kind of municipal records. So kind of a strategic error on the city fathers' part at that time, but really we just don't have the information to track the importation of the material following the American Revolution.
Okay. Were the blocks imported mostly the lighter limestone or a mix of the lighter and the denser limestone?
From in my thesis, it kind of outlines the different sites and what material shows up at each site. And it's really kind of an even spread. The large houses, the Prelo tenant houses, the Pirates Court houses, that's a Oolitic limestone, so it's the lighter material. And so that shows up, in an entire house construction. Whereas we see the harder material typically being used in wall construction and the paving in courtyards, which kind of makes sense. It's a much harder, more dense material, so it lends itself to being used in paving because it's more durable and stands up. The kind of lighter oolitic material, it's easy to abrade. It's very like a soft sandstone, and so I think it wouldn't hold up necessarily as well underfoot or under carriage wheels. So it's typically used more in kind of wall or architectural construction for buildings than the marine deposit. But we really see, at least from the surviving examples that we're able to identify, almost an even distribution for the material that survives today.
Okay. So how is Bermuda limestone and Bermuda stone built houses perceived today by locals?
Yeah, I think it's again built kind of identified as a unique material and a unique makes the property distinct as compared to other structures in the city. I don't think it's kind of as widely known as it was in the 18th century, or necessarily a point of pride, just because the city's demographics have changed so much. The kind of folks who are native Charlestonians who have lived here for generations are definitely more familiar with the material and tend to have kind of closer familial ties to Bermuda, and so are a little more cognizant of that. And some of the really kind of quality preservation contractors here are familiar with the material itself, so it tends to get protected. But I think that's kind of a good jumping off point for presentations like this, lectures like this, or just some other kind of cultural heritage opportunities that could be available, just to sort of reignite those relationships between Charleston and Bermuda. That were so important in the establishment of our city, to really kind of raise awareness and recognition of not just the kind of cultural ties that we have together, but through the material and the cultural built environment that we have that survives as well. Yeah.
Yeah, and hopefully next year I might be able to announce a project that we
Yeah.
and build in some projects between the two of us.
Yeah, it'd be
So
great.
I have one more question. In your research, did you come across reference to the suppliers in Bermuda and the location of the quarries?
Not as much at that time. We have a lot of records on the different kind of ship owners, so the guys who are being taxed for the importation of material. Most of the ones that show up in the city of Charleston are kind of prominent local Charleston merchants. I'm sure some of them share familial names with prominent Bermudian families of that time period. We don't have any Tuckers that I was able to find here in Charleston, who are really the ones who are making the most noise up in Virginia during the American Revolution. But we have lots of different families here in the city that are operating at that time, and we have good kind of taxation records with those names. I can't recall them offhand, but I know I have those materials. So if somebody has questions or wants some of that information, feel free to shoot them my contact info, and I can hand them out. But,
Okay, and we have time for one. It's 6:29, so one last question. Have you come across any gravestones of Bermuda limestone in Charleston?
ooh, that's a great question. Honestly, that I have never looked. That's a great kind of research question, and I'll have to start poking around. Not really. I haven't. I don't know of any offhand. And some of Charleston's earliest graveyards, particularly in the 18th century, they're using wood markers or importing, granite or marble headstones. A lot of slate headstones as well is really prominent in the 18th century here. And so those survive really well. But a lot of those early gravestones, folks, unfortunately, just because of the kind of limited space on the peninsula of Charleston, most of the early 18th century graves end up getting excavated and kind of moved off into different areas, and headstones are kind of moved out of the way or just removed entirely. And so most of the kind of downtown graveyards are populated with kind of end of 18th through the 19th century graves and headstones. So early 18th century stuff is kind of hard to find, but I'm definitely going to go poke around this weekend, I think, and see if I can find any, particularly here in the original walled city, where the material shows up most prevalently. But that's a great question. Yeah, I'll have to look into that.
Okay, well, let me know and I can pass on your findings
Yeah.
to the person who posed the question. So I'm going to wrap up. We do have a lot more questions that are coming in. So we are going to, as this is recorded, by next week, we will have this lecture posted on our website and also on our YouTube channels. We will circulate Justin's thesis for everyone too, because there's a lot of people who want to read your thesis. And I guess if anyone on the webinar would like to be in touch with Justin, please contact the museum and we can pass on further questions or make connections. So I just really want to say thank you so much, Justin. This has been really great. Thank you for sharing your expertise and your knowledge and your time. And thank you to the team of the museum team working behind the scenes who have been fielding the questions and doing all the tech. Thank you, Dr. Deborah Atwood and Katie Bennett. And that's it. That's a wrap. Thank you very much for joining us. Have a good evening.
Thank you all so much.